Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. I'm delighted to have another very esteemed guest joining us today. It's George Yancey. He's professor of sociology at Baylor University and co-author with, I believe it's Ashlee Quosigk. Is that correct?
Quosigk.
Quosigk. Okay.
Yes.
Ashlee Quosigk of this very important book, One Faith No Longer, The Transformation of Christianity in Red and Blue America, published by New York University Press 2021. So it's not quite hot off the press, but I'd say it's still very warm. And one thing I really appreciate about the book, I'll just say at the outset, is there is a lot of being written right now about progressives and conservative Christians going back and forth. Much of it is at a popular level and is rather, I don't know, maybe incendiary. Some of it's lacking in nuance. Well, here you have a rigorous scholarly treatment from a sociological perspective of a lot of these theological themes. And I think it's very important and a timely book. So Professor Yancey, how should I refer to you? Professor Yancey, George, what do you prefer?
However you want to. I'm pretty informal. You're not a student in my class, so you don't have to call me Dr. Yancey.
Okay.
Other than that, I'm good.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I'll go with George then, and I'm Randall or Randy or Rando or whatever. My brother called me Rando growing up, and then today I realized Rando is like means some weird random person. So I think I realized after the fact he was insulting me for 20 years. Anyway, let's get into it. Okay, so One Faith No Longer, that's the title. And what is really good is sometimes titles don't actually convey to you the core thesis, but really this one I think does. So tell me about the title and the core thesis behind the book.
Yeah, I wish I could take credit for the title, but as you know, I mean, you've written books yourself that the publisher actually has to okay it, and you have to okay it too. And my original title was Red Christianity, Blue Christianity, and I thought that's kind of cool title. But they thought it was how should I put it? They thought it wasn't as clear as what the book would be about, and the book is not just about politics. I think that you read the book and so they came with One Faith No Longer, which I thought was a good title, and so yeah, I can't really take credit for that. I wish I could, but I can't.
Sure. So what is the claim then that you're saying with One Faith No Longer?
Yeah, and I know that the central claim, it's controversial, which is fine. I think that's how you push something. You make a controversial argument, and then you see where you go. And the central claim is that what has happened is that what, for lack of a better term, we call progressive Christianity and conservative Christianity have become so different in how they address questions of meaning that we should start talking about them as two separate religions. Now, I'll be very clear. I'm not a theologian. I'm not writing as a theologian. So I'm not saying that this is the true Christianity, this one is not. I'm not making that clear. I will leave it to folks like you to argue about that. That's fine. What I'm saying is that if we look at it as a scholar, that the way they conceptualize meaning is distinct. And even though there's a lot of terminology that's the same that's used, you can also say the same thing about, say, Hinduism and Buddhism. But the way they look at meaning is distinct enough that I think that we should stop talking about them as the same religion. And I think that there's a lot of important implications of that. For example, just to give you one, this is a Christian nation, right? Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean a Christian nation in the sense of a conservative Christian nation or a progressive Christian nation? And to say this Christian nation implies a sort of a monolithic idea, which I think is lacking between conservative and progressive Christians. And so I think there's a lot of implications to my argument, but that's the central argument.
Now, in chapter 2, as I recall, that's a historical chapter where you sort of root the contemporary debate, conversation in historical conflicts between fundamentalist or conservative Christians and mainline liberal Christians in early 20th century America. Is it fair to say then that when you say One Faith No Longer, that actually would apply retroactively, that those groups were not one faith at that time either?
One thing I got from your presentation was the advice to have my book up there. So, because you're right, Sean caught me off balance on his question. So I have it out here. I think it's chapter 1. There's an introduction chapter, and then there's chapter 1 that does that. And to answer your question, I think that is a fair question to think about. Now, I don't have data for back there, so I can't really say. Here's how I would see it. I think you saw the emergence of the separation then. Whether it was complete or not, I think is a that's interesting. I'm not sure when the separation might have been complete. If we argue it is complete, which I do. So maybe it was just emergence, say, when the fundamentals came out, and I think 19 something, I think in the 19 teens or something like that. Yeah. Maybe it was just emerging, and it wasn't really there, and there was a debate there. And maybe it was completed during the 60s and the countercultural revolution. And I don't know. I can't really fully answer that question. My argument is that it is complete at this point in time. Whether it was been this way for the past 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, I think that's a viable question. Yeah.
Okay. And when we have that thesis, your context clearly is the United States. I live in Canada. I lived in Britain for a couple of years during my PhD long ago. And in all of these contexts, of course, 20 years ago, progressive Christian wasn't a thing as a term in Britain. But whether it's in Canada or Britain or the US, evangelical and progressive all have somewhat different meanings, implicature to the terms, cultural associations. So does your thesis then apply to evangelicals and progressives in geographic spaces outside of the United States?
No, not necessarily. I don't think it would necessarily apply outside the United States, since I studied the United States. And so, and it's really, if you think about it, you could have different religions emerging in a single country. And just because it's not true in other countries doesn't mean they've not emerged in that single country. I think it'd be an interesting question. My suspicion is that from what I know, say in some place like Europe, that what we would call progressive Christianity is it's more in the institutions. And what you have in a lot of European nations is where what we call conservative Christians are seen more as a cult in those countries. I know in France, they're seen more as a cult. And so about it, in the United States, it has a certain context where both these groups have a certain amount of power, which I think is lacking in Europe. I would also say that if you're looking at countries where, and I'm not saying Christians are persecuting the United States or anything like that, but there are places where they are. I think that you see those differences really matter less, because at that point in time, just survival means that you just put your differences aside and just try to survive.
Right.
So I think it would manifest itself differently in different countries. Yeah.
Now, the definition, I'd like to talk about the definition you have for progressive and evangelical. So on page 42, you said, we define progressive Christians as Christians who do not envision the Bible as the literal word of God. Christians who define the Bible as the word of God are defined as conservative Christians. And so it seems that an implication of your view is that if a person says the Bible is not literally the word of God, that is sufficient for them to be part of another religion. Is that correct?
No. What I'm saying is, all right, so as a scholar, what I have to do is I have to find a definition, a workable definition. And since I'm going to use empirical research, I have to find a way in which I can separate them out. So what I wanted to do is I didn't want to go to the politics, because then that confuses a lot of other issues. You could look at how people define themselves. The problem is no survey that I know of asks a person, are you a progressive Christian or not? And so I couldn't use a self-definition. So I use a theological definition. So I'm not just saying simply because someone says that the Bible's not the word of God, that automatically makes them progressive Christian. Another component to it, and that is, do you see Jesus Christ as the only way? So there's a two-step component to it. Okay. And so there's a group in the middle, and I'm trying to remember exactly how this worked out. There's a group in the middle that will say that the Bible is the word of God, but Jesus Christ is not the only way. They don't nice and neatly fit into either category. And I realize that there's few things in life where you can just say A or B and everyone's either A or B, and this is one of them. So it's not just merely, and I'm not making the argument merely because someone says that that then they are progressive Christian and they fit into this category of being a separate religion from conservative Christians. So I just want to be very clear about that.
Okay.
But that's just part of the challenge when you're doing academic work,
Right.
that you have to try to create definitions so that you can then study
Yeah.
the results.
All right. So it's actually a two-part. There are two criteria involved. Ultimately, then, is Bible is or is not the literal word of God. Jesus is or is not the only way.
Right. Yeah. There's two-part criteria
Okay.
to that. And other research has shown that's heavily correlated to other theological assumptions. Yes.
Well, I have a question about the second one, because I certainly came upon that one reading through the book. And the issue I have here is I'm concerned that it's ambiguous, that it ambiguates between two different positions, a pluralist position and a soteriological inclusivist position. So a pluralist position being that Jesus saves some individuals, the Buddha or something, and some other account of reconciliation or restoration or whatever, or nirvana, that works for other people, versus a view that says Christ is actually salvifically present in other religious traditions. The second view of a soteriological inclusivism would be a view that the Catholic Church has endorsed since Vatican II, for example, with their concept of anonymous Christians. So do you find that your criterion distinguishes clearly between pluralism and soteriological inclusivism? And if not, would it follow that Catholics aren't Christians?
Well, here's how I look at it this way. So what you have then is, a basic quantitative definition. All right. And then what you do is you look at the quantitative data, and then, certain conclusions fall out of that. And then what we did was we also looked at the qualitative data. Now, I don't think it's as cut and dry as saying you have these two beliefs, therefore you fit into all of these implications of qualitative findings. Let's be honest. There's a lot of people who don't think deeply about these issues. So they're not really driving force for them. So you give them a question and they go, okay, yeah, I guess so. So, you and I, we take these questions more seriously, so we think more deeply about them. Vast majority of Christians do not. And let's just be honest about that. So it's not as simple as saying, if you answer these two things, you are automatically into this other category. What I'm saying is these questions are predictive of certain ideas. And among that, what we found in our qualitative work, these questions and meanings differentiate. And for me, that is really where the dividing line comes to. These things are predictive of that, but they're not the source of that.
Okay.
The dividing line is how you answer questions of meaning. So I would say to that Catholic, if you answer questions of meaning in a certain way, then yeah, I would tend to categorize you as a progressive Christian. If you answer another way, I categorize you as a conservative Christian. These two questions are predictive of whether you're going to do that, but it's not 100%. And that's just not the way research works. It's never 100%.
So in terms of that, that's an important part, definitely, of the way you address the issue, meaning. Now, as I read through the book, I got the sense that for the conservative Christian, sort of theology is ground level. For the progressive Christian, politics, something like that, is more ground level and definitive.
A little more nuance than that, but yeah.
Yeah. I could see if I could pull up.
Yeah, because what we are, and honestly, when I looked at the quantitative data, I came to that conclusion too, that this is politics, this is religion. The qualitative data, and that's why you do qualitative data, because quantitative data can tell you, all right, these patterns are here. To understand the patterns, you go to qualitative data. And the qualitative data told me it's not partisan politics the way we think of politics. It's more these values, the humanistic ethic of social justice that then leads them to, favoring certain political positions. But to me, it's because when I think about politics, I think D and R, I'm supporting D. And it's beyond that. It's these values of social justice that are more the drivers. And then that leads to certain political outcomes.
So I got a quote here that captures it, at least for the progressive side. So on page 13, you wrote, "The goals of progressive Christians seek to support certain social goals tied to an ideal of social justice, and those ideals of social justice appear to be the basis of their religious beliefs." But that it's different for the conservative. For them, it's not that the ideas of social justice are the basis, but rather a theological doctrine is the basis. So broadly.
I'm sorry, you cut out like 10 seconds into your thing, so I didn't hear it.
Okay, so on page 13, you said the goals of progressive Christians seek to support social goals tied to an ideal of social justice. And those ideals of social justice appear to be the basis of the religious beliefs. So for the progressive, social justice is ground level, and then doctrine flows out of the social justice commitment. But for the conservative, it's doctrine that is ground level, and whatever social commitments they have flows out of their doctrine. And so it's a reversal of priority in terms of meaning. I mean, is that kind of a fair way to construe it broadly?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way. Now, one thing I wanted to really be clear as I wrote this book is I don't want it to sound like, well, these conservative Christians, they have all the right biblical beliefs, and it flows out of that. Because as you well know, biblical interpretation is contested. And so what I say is, from their point of view, they see themselves as going to the Bible, and then that's how they come to their conclusions. We can argue how accurate they're doing that. That's fine. I think from what I'm seeing, especially in our qualitative work, the reverse is kind of happening. That these social values, these social justice values, and we could argue once again, as far as are they interpreting social justice values correctly? I think abortion is a really great issue, which that argument really fleshes out. It's not a clone sort of situation. And then from that, and I didn't think of this example after this book was written, but I think it's a really great one. When you think about the whole issue of homosexuality, all right? Okay, so for the conservative Christian, for them, in their minds, they're going to the Bible, and their interpretation, and people can argue about the interpretation, but their interpretation is homosexuality is a sin, therefore we can't endorse it. Now, this is not to say that tolerance does not exist for the conservative Christian. No. And I think that's a mistake some people make, is they're intolerant. They don't have any tolerance. I think that's a mistake. Right? And I'm going to say, and trust me, I'm going to defend progressive Christians in a second too. But I think that's a mistake, all right? But their tolerance to them is interpreted by their understanding of the Bible. Progressive Christians, homosexuality, I think for them, it starts off as a social justice issue and how they interpret that. Now, once again, I think it's a mistake for people to say, well, they don't care about the Bible. No, they don't. They do care about the Bible. They do bring the Bible into it. But I do think that their social justice values help to inform how they see homosexuality. And then they go to the Bible and they use that as well. And so I think that what happens is we have these sort of overarching stereotypes of the groups that, I'm not saying there's no basis in reality, but then we sort of plant them and say, well, these people, they have no tolerance, or these people, they don't even care about the Bible. But I do think that there's a priority dynamic that's happening there.
So when I read that, I mean, I thought in certain ways I think it's helpful. I also think that there's a possibility of misreading the data, and I'm not a sociologist, I'm not talking about that, but theologically. So when we talk about the social justice as sort of ground level, I mean, I think insofar as I understand progressive Christians that I talk to, and insofar as I identify with some of those broader theological trends, it's an understanding theologically of the kingdom of God as not simply being in this pie in the sky by and by, sort of the otherworldly dispensational theology that many people have grown up with. And I think many people who come out of evangelicalism and are attracted toward progressive Christianity, they're coming out of this sort of world denying understanding of eschatology. And they're attracted to this very different view that says, no, theologically, the kingdom of God is breaking into the midst now and is expressed as Jesus declares when he kicks off his ministry in Luke 4, about this involves matters of social justice as central to the Christians' missio Dei, their action and being in the world. So that I think they would say, and certainly I would say, it's not that social justice that is non-theological is the foundation for doctrine to flow out of it, but rather the very framework of social justice commitments is a theologically framed one. Does that make sense? And if
Yeah,
it does,
you know,
would that minimize the meaning contrast?
yeah, you know, I hear that argument, and I respect the argument. You know what where I come from, where I come back is first, I think the quantitative data shows that, and I'll just say this up front because I know that sometimes the quantitative data, uh, I couldn't really talk about certain aspects of it in the chapter. It's in the appendix and it's more complicated. So I don't want to bore your audience by really diving into what the appendix. But I think it's pretty clear in the quantitative data, once you really look at it, is that progressive Christians, their reference groups are not based on theological considerations. You know, they accept, relatively speaking, atheists and Muslims more than other Christians. So you have to ask questions. All right, when you what we know about outgroups and in-groups and how that constructs your social identity. What does it say when your social identity, when political alliances are more important than theological alliances? As a scholar, I have to say that those political alliances or social justice alliances, as I came to understand them, outweigh more than theological considerations, which was different for conservative Christians, which is why I argue that for them, that theological alliance is vital, is that sort of ground floor. And that's not to say that it doesn't have an importance to progressive Christians, but I look at that data coupled with some of the qualitative work. We haven't discussed the blogs, for example. You know, when we looked at the blogs and we found when trying to justify their position on abortion, the progressive Christians did not use the Bible hardly at all. Conservative Christians who were advocating for a more progressive immigration policy, so they're going against their political allies, went to the Bible. That says something to me. So the evidence suggests that if you want to look at it as maybe conservative Christians look at their vision of the Bible. Once again, I'm not getting into theological, whether they're right or not. I mean, I'll let everyone else, I have my own opinions, but that's not important. I'll let everyone else debate that. That conservative Christians see that their at least the Bible as more important, relatively speaking, than progressive Christians. I think that that's pretty clear. If you want to argue, well, we still see the Bible as sort of the ground as well as social justice. I think that's a fair argument. I can't get deeply into that, but I still, for conservative Christians, I do think that it is more central to their social identity, to how they're going to see things. I think that's pretty clear when you look at the quantitative data and some of this qualitative data.
You've been talking about quantitative and qualitative data, but maybe kind of take a step back and
to define it.
Yeah, well, to define it and then kind of give us a quick overview thumbnail sketch of how you gathered your information.
Sure. So, yeah, and I should have thought about this. I assume that I'm in a sociology class right now. Quantitative data is like surveys. It's like census. We get a lot of people, and you give them a survey, and so you can calculate systematically differences. And so, if I wanted, for example, if I want to argue that men make more money than women, I would not look at Oprah Winfrey, right? Because she makes a ton of money. She could buy and sell both of us and probably half your audience. But I would look at the averages of the money men make and the average of money women make, and I'll come to the conclusion. That's quantitative data. Qualitative data is when you do interviews or where you do content analysis, because then you can look at what people are saying about stuff and you go further deep into it. And so for the quantitative data, I used a survey that's a representative sample. It comes out every 4 years, I believe. And so I use that for my quantitative data. Qualitative data, two sources. We looked at blogs, and we're looking at blogs at people who are going against their political grain. So we looked at pro-life progressive Christians and pro-immigration reform conservative Christians, because we figured that's where you're going to see the tension. And we did interviews. So we chose to stick with evangelicals, progressive evangelicals, and conservative evangelicals. Interviewed leaders, members of 2 churches, and that's how you get qualitative data. So that's how I collected my data, or we collected our data, rather.
Well, you mentioned, and this was interesting, definitely how progressive Christians identify more with Muslims and atheists in certain respects than the conservative Christians. Um, I guess first of all, I would ask again whether this is theologically motivated in terms of they're reaching out to outgroups.
Well,
Like,
let me clarify something. It's
yeah,
not that they identified with them more than they identified with them more. In other words, they saw themselves closer to Muslims, closer to atheists, than they saw themselves closer to conservative Christians.
right. Yeah,
So it's not that they were more accepting of them. They saw conservative Christians as the outgroup.
yeah,
And so to me, that has some very important theological considerations because an atheist, if you're a progressive Christian, theologically, who you're close to, an atheist or a conservative Christian. At least a conservative Christian, you at least have the Christian moniker. Atheists, you don't even have that, right?
yeah. One of the so here let me, if I don't even have to play devil's advocate, I think I can speak for the way a lot of progressives would kind of engage with that,
Yeah.
and so I think what they would say is it's kind of like Jesus identifying more with the Samaritan or the tax collector or leper or the woman caught in adultery rather than the Pharisees, who should be his closer in group, but who he is judging as being hypocritical. And I think many progressives, uh, I mean, one of the things I think is a huge factor is Donald Trump is somewhat of the elephant in the room. I think he's really skewed things in the last 7 years, led to a hyper polarization. And from the perspective of many progressives, this growing frustration and sense of disaffection and alienation toward conservatives because of the way that they've identified with Trump, and in a way that often seems grossly hypocritical. For example, having attacked Bill Clinton for his sexual proclivities, but yet finding rationalizations for Trump's sexual proclivities, things like that. And so they would say, well, I mean, it's I'm being in that sense like Jesus condemning people who I view as hypocrites, whether they're right or not. I think
Yeah.
that would be their kind of perspective on it.
Yeah. I'm no fan of Trump, to say the least. And I would say that the polarization predated Trump. So I don't think he's the creation of the polarization. I would agree with you that he's made it worse. So, so none of this is to defend Trump or anything like that. So I'm looking at, so I'm just looking at this as a scholar. I hear that but if you have more sympathy towards a group that is very distinctive from you, then that group is your in group, right? So now, as far as whether Jesus made his in group or the sinners his in group and not the Pharisees, I think that's an interesting question. That's something for theologians. But as a scholar, that becomes your in group when you have more sympathy towards other groups. Your in group is more geared towards people who you agree with on social justice. As a scholar, I have to conclude then that that's where your identity lies in more than the other individuals. Now, it'd be one thing if none of them were the in groups, and maybe maybe there's some degree where that's somewhat true. But where I make that argument with just the quantitative data, I think the qualitative data shows that, at least for some progressive Christians, truly they see the Muslims as their in group, as their brother, in a way that they don't see conservative Christians. And so to me, that makes them an in group.
Something else I was going to ask you about that, but it escapes me now. Oh, yeah. So I also wanted to ask then, it seems to me that progressives generally would respond very differently on average toward Black evangelicals versus white evangelicals. You talk about that there is a clear difference between Black and white evangelicals. For example, I mean, Black evangelicals are more likely to align with a democratic, socially progressive agenda than the white ones, white evangelicals. So it seems it complexifies it for me.
It does.
Because then it's like progressive, they're not going to have the same degree of hostility at all toward Black evangelicals as generally that they would toward white.
And I saw the book, which I think is a very fair critique, is that we didn't look at the racial issues seriously enough, and which is ironic because that's where I'm at right now. My space right now is looking at racial issues, but I guess, I was in a place where I thought, well, I didn't want to complicate it. But you're right. But I think that even reinforces my argument, because the reason why I suspect that they accept Black evangelicals easier is that Black evangelicals are more, well, Black evangelicals are in an interesting space. And because I didn't look at them, I'm sort of speculating right now. I think Black evangelicals do take seriously theological considerations and social justice considerations. I've not studied them, so I don't know what side which may influence them more so. In the history of the Black church, it was a religion built on resistance to slavery. So all that's of interest. It makes it palatable for progressive Christians. By the way, in many ways, because they also, are very theological, a lot of white evangelicals are very sympathetic to Black evangelicals as well. So I don't, I'm not saying that progressive Christians love them and conservative Christians hate Black evangelicals. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that they're in this interesting space. I just reviewed a book called a history book on Black evangelicals, which I think starts to look at that space. And I think that there's a need for research on the space of Black evangelicals. So yeah, it does bring a complexity there. And yeah, we probably should have tried to do something with that, or do more than what we did.
So when you're talking about the idea of one of these groups emerging as a distinct religion from the other, or them kind of fracturing off from one another, you give an analogy, an illustration of Hinduism and Buddhism.
Yeah.
And so somewhat analogously, I guess you could, of course, endless examples,
Right.
Sikhism and Islam, Hinduism, so on. One of the things, however, that it seems counterintuitive to me is, as you gathered your data, it was clear that there are many self-identifying progressive Christians worshiping in and full participants in evangelical churches. And I probably suspect it goes to some degree in the opposite direction as well, but certainly in that case. So it seems to have the counterintuitive result then that there are people sitting side by side in a pew on a Sunday morning who are adherents to different religions.
Yeah. Yeah, but would that surprise you? Sometimes I have a friend who's an atheist who, but she got divorced she was married to a Christian guy. And so she takes her kids to a Christian church because, so by side, a Christian and atheist in a church setting. I don't think that is an unusual thing. And of course, this is not going to be a clear cut, one day we're going to just announce, here's this religion, here's that religion. I think it's a fascinating dynamic to watch to see how this could happen. But yeah, I don't see that as a major issue.
Okay. I was also, examples. So I have someone like Kenneth Copeland is considered an evangelical. Someone like Timothy Keller is an evangelical. Shane Claiborne is generally considered a progressive. But it seems to me that Shane Claiborne and Tim Keller's theology is much more similar than Kenneth Copeland's is to Keller's. Mm-hmm. And what that suggests to me is I think there's an enormous amount of theological diversity and contrast, as you've described meaning as being foundational. There's an enormous diversity of meaning in the evangelical community, much greater, in fact, than between many progressives and many evangelicals. As with Claiborne and Keller. So if we went more fine-grained in terms of our analysis of evangelicalism as a diverse sociological entity, would we end up with multiple religions within evangelicalism?
Well, and that's a good question in that, for example, we can look at Christianity itself. We know that Christianity emerged, the Eastern Orthodox emerged from Catholicism, and then you had the Protestants emerged from Catholicism, and yet we still consider them all one Christian faith. And so, and this is not just Christianity. Obviously, when you look at Islam, our Shiites and Sunnis and Sufi Muslims, we still consider that to be one faith. So how much difference do you have to have? And that's why I look at questions of meaning more than theology. Because to me, question of meaning, once you have a different question of meaning, then you have a different goal. And to me, that shapes a lot of what religion is supposed to be. part of this is my own bias. I'll just be honest, because I define religion as a way people address questions of meaning. And that's how I define religion. And as a sociologist, that works well for me. Because now I can look at religion in even secular countries. Because if you're trying to address questions of meaning, that has implications as to how you should construct your society and your values and your norms and things of that nature. So to me, that is a central element of religion. And so for me, once that is distinctive, you can argue over whether women should be pastors or not, or whether homosexuality is a sin or not, or all these other things. But if your meanings are different, to me, you're heading in different directions. And so I'm not looking at the theological diversity. I think that's an interesting question, one for a theologian. Is the differences in evangelicalism greater than between evangelicals and progressive Christians? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. But to me, I'm looking at those questions of meaning as what is separating the two groups.
One important theme, I think, in the book is to highlight an ongoing trend of the continued devaluation or weakening of denominations as theological, cultural, social signifiers, and the movement toward things like liberal and conservative as being much more definitive. I think on page 225, you affirm a couple of individuals, Lehman and Shurkot, who quote that we need to decouple religious identity from denominational affiliation. And they propose thinking as the more important categories rather than like Baptist, Pentecostal, Reformed, rather thinking about liberal, moderate, sectarian, Protestant. If you want to think about what is most foundational for Protestant, sort of the primary colors, I guess, it would be liberal, moderate, and sectarian. I know those are their terms, but so can you say a little bit more about that and the social significance of the decline of denominational identity, and what becomes more important is like whether you're progressive or liberal or sectarian or moderate?
Yeah, I mean, there's been work on this for several years. I mean, I'm not bringing anything new to the table on this. That denominations were once a really great indicator of social identity, and they're very valuable. And there's been a lot of work showing that denominationalism is important. The rise of non-denominational, interdenominational churches, what's that about? Well, that's about people who say, well, I don't really care about a denomination. And I don't think there's any serious work that says denomination is where the action is. Now, you look at it and we use it. I think that there is some correlation, say, between a mainline Protestant and your theological beliefs and a conservative Protestant. I think there is some correlation. I don't think it's useless, but I just don't find it as important any longer, other than to use it as a predictive variable.
I want to turn to page 213, and this is something I want to follow up a little bit on. It was probably one of the more sort of eye-catching or headline-grabbing, I think, results of your study, which is that, on your view, the data supports the conclusion that progressive Christians, and we've already touched on this, but that they tend to be less embracing of conservative Christians than conservative are of the progressives. So you said on page 213 at the bottom, to be sure, critiques of progressive Christianity by conservative Christians exist, and you cite some examples, but there is not the sense of war against other Christians that is more common among progressive Christians. So I wanted to, I made, as I mentioned to you before we started, a little slideshow. I've just got like 6 slides where I wanted to give examples, anecdotal examples, where I think conservative Christians very much are on the warpath, as it were, against progressive Christians, and then just get your response to that. Okay, so as I said, I made a quick slideshow of just 6 examples. So you cited, as I said, on that quote on page 213, of 4 examples of conservative Christians who are critiquing progressives. One of them was Alyssa Childers. So she, of course, wrote a very popular book, Another Gospel. Here she is appearing on The Beat by Alan Parr, a major YouTube channel, so over 120,000 views. And the descriptor is progressive Christianity and why it's worse than atheism. Now, in fairness, I mean, I think Parr, when he chose the title for this video, I think he's looking for headlines. And so it was one thing that came up in the middle of the interview. That's not like the major theme. She's just generally warning about progressive Christianity. But nonetheless, she does make this view that in key respects, progressive Christianity is worse than atheism. It's more dangerous than atheism. And central to her view is that it's another gospel altogether and another religion. And that progressive Christians, she describes them as being deceivers and having malintent toward conservative Christians. Doreen Virtue is another very popular YouTuber. So here's her video, Proof that Progressive Christianity is New Age Heresy. That has 64,000 views. So I'm not selecting like really obscure examples here. Frank Turek is a major Christian apologist. This has been one of his big themes, is attacking progressive Christianity as another gospel and another religion, and promoting Childers' work as well. Coming to a heretical church near you, this tweet says. Mama Bear Apologetics, same analysis, is that progressive Christianity is a fundamentally different religion. It's dangerous. And Breakpoint, they've, of course, Chuck Colson's ministry, famously, John Stone Street here, a 5-minute little audio, which goes out on, syndicated on national radio, Why Progressive Christianity is Another Gospel. Here's a recent edition from May of this year from Decision magazine with Franklin Graham, Progressive Christianity Can Lead You to Hell. And then, I mean, even your own stuff, right? Like this very book, right, is arguing that progressive, now you're not saying, as you've stressed, that progressive Christianity is wrong. That's beyond your purview as a sociologist, but you are arguing that these are different religions. All these other people are saying not only are there different religions, it's dangerous religion, it's false. So I think that there's a lot of evidence anecdotally that I see for the idea of conservatives being at least, if not more, hostile toward progressives than I see in reverse. So what would be your response to this admittedly anecdotal selection, and how did you come across the result that you found?
Okay, so this is why I wanted to use Oprah Winfrey as my earlier example. Okay, so obviously I'm not claiming that there are no conservative Christians out there, and I'll leave people to decide whether or not your interpretation of their work is what is. I don't want to get involved. I'm trying not to get involved with the argument of the progressive and conservative Christians. But I'm not saying that there aren't, I could probably find you even more striking examples than this if I really went and looked, people who are really more striking. So I'm not saying there are no conservative Christians who don't like progressive Christians or hateful. That'd be ridiculous for me to say that. But Oprah Winfrey exists. And so you could take her and take about 5 other very wealthy women and say, why are women complaining about men making more money? Look at Oprah Winfrey. Look at the daughter of Walton, the person who owns Walmart. Look at these people. Or if you want, why do we say men are taller than women? Look at Brittany Griner. Look at Maria Sharapova. These women are taller than men. That's why anecdotal evidence is so dangerous as far as trying to make generalizable. This is why we use quantitative data. So quantitatively, that's what I'm looking at. And quantitatively, and there is the quantitative evidence which shows that progressive Christians that they envision certain Christians as in a lower strata than other religious groups. Certain Christians don't do that to progressive Christians. That's quantitative. That's when you look at multiple numbers. And really, when you think about it, I think that some of this is distorted by the fact there's more conservative Christians than progressive Christians. So when they become political, people see that. Before the moral majority, conservative Christians really had an attitude towards politics of, that's dirty stuff, I don't want to be in it. And a lot of conservative Christians still have that attitude. And so we have to take them into consideration as well when you're looking at the average. We're looking at what the average is, not just the outliers.
Right.
And so when you start doing that, you start looking at data showing that these attitude changes, that there are differences in these attitude changes. That for progressive Christians, that there's less respect for conservative Christians and vice versa. I also will just say at the end that in doing this research, I joined a lot of different Facebook groups of conservative Christians and progressive Christians. And this is not systematic, so I'll just leave it as is. It's sort of anecdotal, but that had an impression on me. When I go to conservative Christians' websites, except, there's one exception that focuses on Christianity. For the most part, they're not talking about progressive Christians. They really are not. That I don't want to hurt your feelings, but they're not thinking about y'all that much. When I go to the progressive Christians' websites, most of the time they're talking about conservative Christians and how wrong, and many of them will say because Christians are not Christians. So I've read that. So I'm very comfortable with my assertion because it's based on a quantitative research. And once again, I just want to be very clear. Obviously, Oprah Winfrey exists, Brittany Griner exists. You have exceptions. You have outliers. It's not a 100% thing. There are progressive Christians who probably love conservative Christians too. So so it goes other ways. We have to look at the averages in order to get a sense of that sort of thing.
Okay. One more question to come back to kind of meaning in different religions before I'll ask you a concluding question and we'll kind of wrap up. And we went a little longer than I'd anticipated, but I think it's been wonderful. I really appreciate the engagement. So to come back to the criterion of the degree to which there is a difference in understanding meaning and these different doctrines, which is sufficient to warrant these being considered different religions, I'm wondering if a consistent application of that methodology would lead to a plethora of different religions that are all Christian, but which were historically recognized as being the same religion. For example, it seems to me that like Russian Orthodox Christianity, Plymouth Brethren Christianity, Baptist and Pentecostal Christianity, Quakerism, they're all, if you drill down to it, in different regions of the world, very different in some of these areas. So would the methodology you've applied here lead to the conclusion that there in fact are many Christianities which are all distinct religions, but which we've errantly called one Christianity? As David Barrett's World Christian Encyclopedia, right, says there's like 6 major ecclesiastical blocks, there's 30,000 denominations. Maybe there, in fact, this is not one Christianity. Maybe there's like hundreds of Christianities. Is that a possibility? And would it be one you'd be okay accepting?
I'd be skeptical of hundreds of Christianities. Is there more than one? It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. I think in order to make those assertions, though, I think you need to do some of the sort of work that Ashlee and I did. I think you need to look at it quantitatively, because you don't want to just do qualitative work, because then you get into problems of using anecdote as evidence. But then you also want to do some qualitative work to see, are they really defining their religion in a way that looks at a different answer to questions of meaning. Now, from what I know of Pentecostals and Baptists, I would say the answer is no. Not to say there aren't exceptions to that, remember, but I would say that they have some differences in theological beliefs and gets the spirit and things of that nature. But ultimately, their question of meaning is roughly the same. And so I would say no. But could there be more? I mean, I'm not gonna. I like to go to that famous line in Rudy, the movie. There's 2 things about theology I'm certain of. 1, there is a God, and 2, I'm not him. So it's possible, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, as a capsule example, Palestinian Christians in Israel, in the occupied territories, versus conservative Protestant dispensationalists who are supporting the state of Israel from America, those would seem to be pretty fundamentally different. And so I certainly think you would have many different Christians.
I think that's a political difference. I'm not sure that that's a meaning difference, though.
Okay.
I
want to come back, or to conclude, it's kind of the big question: where do we go from here? Now, something that I actually wasn't thinking of at the outset of this interview, but which popped into my mind as we were talking, in the early 20th century, I think it was, the Worldwide Church of God Armstrongism was founded. Anyway, it was eventually recognized to, I think, to be a cult or a non-Christian group, something outside of historic Orthodox Christianity. But Joseph Tkach, in the early 90s, when he became the head of that church, and I haven't done any update on this, I didn't prepare for this, but when the conversation was going on in the early 90s, he was in a lot of dialogue with the Bible Answer Man, I remember at the time, Hank Hanegraaff, and he actually led Armstrongism into becoming what Hanegraaff ended up calling like a Orthodox Protestant group. that they move from unorthodoxy to orthodoxy. And so one of the things I think I'm wondering at this point, if these are two different religions, do they just go their separate ways? Is there a possibility of dialogue that could bring them back to merge again? I guess it's now an interreligious dialogue rather than an ecumenical dialogue.
I think that's a really interesting question. Stepping away from my hat as a sociologist, speculating, what do I think? I'm gonna put this in a good context, because as I said, I'm back in dealing with racial issues, and I won't get all into that, but I am. And so I know how hard it is to have dialogue on tough issues. And so just to put this in the right context, my belief, I don't have the empirical evidence to back this up, this is my speculation. My belief is that the divide is much deeper than people give it credit for. And it's gonna be easier for whites and blacks to have racial dialogue than for progressive Christians and conservative Christians to have dialogue on a religious basis. I think the divide is that deep. Now, I could be wrong on that. There's a part of me that hopes that I'm wrong on that, because let's try to get along with, and that doesn't mean that we don't have the responsibility of getting along with one another. And so if we want to talk about, hey, can we have a language that's not so toxic toward one another? I think there could be value to that. But as far as a reunification, I'm very skeptical of that. And maybe in 10 years from now, I'll be proven wrong. There'll be some sort of great conference, and there'll be hugging together and stuff like that. And I'd be happy to see that. But I'm skeptical because of just how deep the division is. I will say that I think progressive Christians understand this better than conservative Christians do, to be honest. A lot of the conservative Christians still think of us as a Christian nation. And to me, the finding that you may find most challenging, that progressive Christians think less of conservative Christians and vice versa, actually works against conservative Christians, because they don't realize how deep the divide is. And they think that progressive Christians are potential allies. And I'm the one telling them, no, they're really not. So I just think that is just an incredibly deep divide. And I think we have to recognize that and then decide what we want to do with that. But yeah, I think it'd be a very tough conversation.
I think you're probably right about that. All right, we're going to conclude it there. I want to thank you, Professor Yancey, for the conversation, and to everybody. I highly recommend you pick up One Faith No Longer. I think it's a very important book, and certainly got me thinking. And yeah, there are, whether you think progressive and evangelical are different religions or not, I think Professor Yancey's careful research has shone a spotlight on the depth of some of the divisions that do exist. And we all have to ask the question, where do we go from here? So thank you very much.